All right. I'm calling this meeting of the regularly scheduled Committee of the Whole to order. My name is Elizabeth Glidden. I am the chair of this committee, and I am joined today by council members Cano, Bender, Andrew Johnson, Yang, Quincy, and Fry, and we are a quorum of this committee. We do have a very full agenda today. It includes 4 items, including our awaited results of a study on a minimum wage increase. And that item will come up a little bit later in the agenda. Our first item of business, however, is a public hearing on the classified service ordinance. This is an action that we are taking subsequent to the council's previous action to remove the Rule of 3 language from the city charter a few months ago. And so I'm going to invite up, I believe Ms. Ferguson is going to give us an overview report of the ordinance that would then essentially replace the language that had been in the charter, and then we will open the public hearing. Thank you very much, Ms. Ferguson.
Thank you, Vice President Glidden, members of the Committee of the Whole. On May 4th, 2016, the Charter Commission approved a proposal to amend the city charter to eliminate the Rule of 3 in hiring decisions and authorizing the City Council to adopt an appropriate ordinance regarding hiring procedures. On July 26, 2016, the Minneapolis City Council amended the city charter to eliminate the Rule of 3 language from the charter. The provision allows for the council to establish modern procedures by ordinance and, in addition, directed the Human Resources Department to draft an ordinance amending Title II, Chapter 20 of the Minneapolis Code of Ordinance relating to administration personnel. A draft ordinance was drafted, and it contains the guiding principles used for selection processes. We engaged a variety of methods to engage the various stakeholders, including the labor representatives. We've had 3 meetings with them. We also had an additional conversation with them this week. We engaged the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board, the Civil Service Commission, and we also reviewed the proposed draft ordinance with the city coordinator as well as with the city attorney's office. Revisions to the draft ordinance were made based on stakeholder feedback. And so the proposed ordinance, which you have in front of you, calls for merit-based procedures for assessing applicants and filling vacancies in the classified service. The procedures are based on sound human resource principles, which support the values and goals of the city of Minneapolis, are based on bona fide job qualifications, seek to eliminate personal and/or institutional bias in hiring decisions, include measures that promote continuous improvement in the hiring process, and result in an eligibility register consisting of a pool of qualified candidates. If applicable, collective bargaining agreements contain a different procedure. The procedure in the applicable collective bargaining agreement shall be followed by the City of Minneapolis. The Human Resources Department recommends the adoption of the ordinance before you.
All right. Thank you very much for that presentation. For council members, I'm still getting into my computer system, so I don't have speaker management up yet in case anyone has clarifying questions. And I'll just note as well that we have been joined by council members Gordon, Reich, and Palmisano. And so thank you to them for being here as well. So I'm not seeing any clarifying questions from council members. So our next step is to open the public hearing. And we will ask, and you may go ahead and take a seat.
Thank you.
And we can ask if there is anyone here who wishes to speak to this proposed ordinance. And we had not received any advance notice of anybody. Oh, Mr. Michaels. And if you would just introduce yourself, please.
I will. Madam Chair, council members, my name is Jim Michaels. I'm a labor representative, represent 3 bargaining units in the city of Minneapolis, the Police Federation, Firefighters Local 82, and also the Public Works Engineers. As you probably are aware, the issue of the Rule of 3 has been something that has been talked about between several levels of the city's leadership and the labor unions for the better part of probably 15 to 20 years. We remain a partner in trying to advance the goals of the city, and the fact that the ordinance now is replacing what was in the charter is something that we've already started the process of talking with Mr. Giles and with Ms. Ferguson about how to implement those things in a way that will be collaborative and in the best interests of everyone. The primary goal, and I just speak for my bargaining units, I can't speak for all of labor, although, you know, the Board of Business Agents has obviously discussed this issue several times as well. The main interest, I would say, is that that among the goals that we advance would be hiring the best qualified people for the job. We understand that one of the problems with the rule of three may have been that it was kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. And there may be a significant difference in the way that you might hire a professional engineer from the way you might hire a clerk typist or a fire captain. And I think that that's one of the things that this ordinance will give us the flexibility to try and find those approaches. In an initial conversation that labor representatives, including myself, had with Tim Giles a couple of weeks ago, Tim actually came up with an idea that all of labor really supported, and that was to create a subgroup of the Citywide Labor Management Committee. Tim's idea was to call it the HP LMC, which is Hiring and Promotion LMC, not something that would make printers or computers. But the HP LMC would function quite similar to the Benefits Labor Management Committee, or the BLMC, which I think has an outstanding track record of collaborative work that's saved the city employees and the taxpayers of the city literally millions of dollars. So using that model, I think that was a good vehicle for us to have the types of discussions that would implement the ordinance, assist HR in coming up with the policies that would fulfill the scope of the ordinance. So my main purpose in addressing you this morning is just to let all of you know that the devil is always in the details, but at least as where we stand right now, whatever controversy or concerns there may have been with labor about the manner in which the charter was amended, we're setting those aside and we're moving forward, and we look forward in working with the HR staff of coming up with something that serves the best interests of everyone. Because the one thing that we all have in common, regardless of which avenue gets us to the table, is the desire to do good work and to serve the people who live, work, and play in the city of Minneapolis as best as we can. So we will find a way to work through this. And like I said, I just wanted to have the check-in with you to let you know. And we do ask for your support of the HP LMC as a model to continue those discussions. It's not a substitute for collective bargaining. To the extent that some of the processes involve collective bargaining, that will be handled at the bargaining table. But in just coming up with guidelines and best practices and those types of things, I think it's good to include labor in those discussions, because a lot of times we can come up with something that is helpful to everybody, as witnessed by the BLMC. So that's all I really wanted to say. I'll be happy to answer any questions if there are any, but I just wanted to take this opportunity to kind of input you from at least 3 labor units perspective on this issue.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Michaels. I really appreciate you took your time to be here. I'm not seeing questions for you. I will ask if there is anyone else who would like to speak as part of the public hearing? Anyone else who would like to speak as part of the public hearing on the classified service ordinance? I'm not seeing anyone. So I will go ahead and close the public hearing. Again, we have in front of us this ordinance. that replaces the mechanism that used to be called the Rule of Three that was utilized in the city charter. I'm going to go ahead and move approval of the ordinance, and like just to make a couple comments of appreciation again to what I think has been a very good staff team that has worked on this, and I think also, as we see from Mr. Michaels being here and taking his time to let us know about the process from his perspective, that it was done so in a manner that really engaged labor and our Board of Business Agents. And I think that was also a message that came from the council, is that we wanted to make sure those relationships were valued as we move forward in this new way of doing business. So anyone else? Discussion? Councilmember Gordon?
Thank you very much. I'm certainly supportive of this. I also like the idea of a HPLMC, and I'm not sure if HR department needs any direction or anything like that, but I think if it makes sense for them to set that up. I know that the citywide labor management committee is meeting, I think, later today. So maybe that's an issue that they could also take up and make sure that everybody in that room is supportive of it. But I just thought I'd take this opportunity to speak here, saying that sounds like a really good idea. And I think the more working together, the more communication we can have, and whatever makes sense to the citywide labor management team, I'm certainly willing to support that. And so I appreciate Mr. Michaels bringing that forward.
Thank you, Councilmember Gordon. And I'll just, maybe that's a question of Ms. Ferguson. My understanding is that there would not need to be a direction from the council to do that type of work together between staff and labor. It kind of, again, follows the model of the Benefits Committee, which I don't believe had a council direction setting that. It was something that was agreed upon between those stakeholders, and has been very, very helpful. Any other discussion on the ordinance? Not seeing any, so all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? And that item is approved. Thank you very, very much. Next, we have a brief consent item, which is passage of a resolution directing employees, elected officials, and members of city boards and commissions to watch the political activity ethics video. And this, again, is a consent item. I will move approval. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye. 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 Opposed? And that item is approved. Now we are to an item that I know has been eagerly awaited. This is a presentation on the results of a study evaluating a minimum wage increase in Minneapolis and Hennepin County, Ramsey County. And I believe Mr. Frank, there he is, David Frank was going to give us an overview introduction and then help introduce the speakers who conducted the study.
That's right.
Mr. Frank.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Madam Chair and committee members. I'm David Frank from CPED, and we, your staff team, are here together with Dr. Samuel Myers and his team to present the results of the study of a minimum wage increase in Minneapolis and in Hennepin and Ramsey County. Just a quick recap of how we got here based on your direction. In April of 2015, the City Council passed a Supporting a Strong Economy and Working Families resolution, which directed staff to develop a recommendation for the study of the effects of establishing a minimum wage regionally and locally, and to develop the funding and the development of that study no later than third quarter of 2015. In September of 2015, the City Council authorized issuance of a request for proposals for comprehensive economic analysis of a citywide minimum wage increase, and separately the impacts of a minimum wage increase in Hennepin and Ramsey County. And then this February of 2016, City Council authorized a contract for Minneapolis minimum wage increase study to be conducted by the competitively selected research team consisting of representatives from the University of Minnesota, Howard University, Rutgers University, and the Economic Policy Institute. The scope of the study was to examine the impacts of a minimum wage increase in the city of Minneapolis and in Hennepin and Ramsey County. The study looked at an increase to $12 and to $15, each phased in over 5 years. The research team, as I say, led by the Roy Wilkins Center at the University of Minnesota, reviewed existing peer-reviewed literature on minimum wage changes and replicated techniques prevalent in other studies to evaluate a minimum wage increase in Minneapolis and in Hennepin and Ramsey County. As you will hear, the study found that of the city's 311,000 workers, 47,000 would be affected by an increase to $12 per hour minimum wage, and 71,000 would be affected by an increase to $15 an hour minimum wage. The study also found that workers of color would disproportionately benefit from a minimum wage increase. Even though 2/3 of the total workforce in the city is white, half of the workforce affected by a $15 minimum wage is white. Latino and Black workers are more likely to be affected than others. And I should point out, too, that service industries like restaurants, retail, fast food, healthcare, and childcare are where minimum wage work is concentrated and where the benefits and the impacts will be felt most strongly by both employees and employers. A quick thanks to some of my colleagues, and then I will introduce the researchers. Thank you to many of you and your offices, to the mayor's office, and most especially my colleagues, Mark Brinda, Andrew Dahl, Sasha Bergman, Nuria Rivera-Vandermeide, Jeff Schneider, Greta Bergstrom, and Sarah McKenzie. And I will switch presentations here. There it is. I'd like to introduce Thomas Durfee, researcher at the Roy Wilkins Center at the University of Minnesota, who will introduce the rest of the research team and step us through the minimum wage study. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Frank. Mr. Durfee.
Thank you very much, and good morning. Thank you, Madam Chair, for inviting us to present the findings of our report today. We'd also like to thank the City Council for listening to our findings, and we would like to also thank Councilwoman Cano for making the request for proposal known to us. Today, I'm going to be outlining the key findings of our minimum wage simulation study. Our team has a series of economists and researchers who advised the project. Dr. Sam Myers acted as the principal investigator for the project. Dr. William Spriggs acted as an economic advisor. We also had Dr. Monica Garcia Perez from St. Cloud State University acting as an economic advisor. Dr. William Rogers is not able to be here today. However, he gave economic advice with respect to food security and the response to food security after an increase in the minimum wage. We also had David Cooper from the Economic Policy Institute provide economic policy analysis as well as demographic analysis for our simulation. We also had a team of researchers including Yufeng Lai, Juliette Santamaria, Manzu, and myself. The purpose of this presentation today is to inform the public of the findings of our recent simulation. The goals of this presentation is going to be to establish a baseline of what the changes of the what changes from this minimum wage would look like, to explain what we did in our simulation, and to highlight some of the key findings of our report. First, looking at the size of the affected workforce, as David Frank mentioned, the projected size of the Minneapolis workforce in the year 2021 is 311,000. We're using 2021 as our comparison year because the simulation that we employed assumes an incremental increase in the current minimum wage using the Minnesota minimum wage as a baseline and then increasing until the minimum wage reaches either $15 or $12 by 2021. We find that 46,000 members of the Minneapolis workforce would be affected by a $12 minimum wage and 71,000 by a $15 minimum wage. The earnings effects that we have simulated range from 6 to 16% for $12 and from 13 to 31% for a $15 minimum wage. One clarification that is important to make is that the earnings simulated by the Roy Wilkins Center reflect quarterly earnings, not hourly earnings. So any changes that we represent today would represent changes not just in an hourly rate, but in actual income that is brought home by households. Next, we found that after simulating many different models for the effect of employment in response to a minimum wage, we found that there was little statistically significant evidence of the change of a minimum wage. Finally, we modeled the business responses to changes in the minimum wage, highlighting there are many different ways which businesses may respond, but highlighted for the sake of these key findings, we find that operational costs would have an upper bound of around 2% for a $12 minimum wage and 5.4% for a $15 minimum wage. Again, this is in the year 2021 when the policy is set to simulated to finish. In order to explain the context for the current the simulated minimum wage, we first have to establish what the current minimum wage is. And the problem is that there are actually several minimum wages that are operating for Minneapolis residents right now, not just a single one. The current minimum wage is $9.50 an hour for employees who work at firms that are earning more than $500,000 a year in gross sales receipts. Small firms are then required under the same under earning less than $500,000 to pay $7.75 an hour. And small firms that after there are 82% of firms in the Minneapolis area that are eligible to pay this lower rate. However, it should be noted that just because a firm is eligible to pay a lower rate does not require them to do so, and indeed many firms choose to pay a higher rate regardless. We also find that in the Hennepin and Ramsey area, there is a similar distribution of large and small firms. Finally, the federal minimum wage follows a similar design as the Minnesota state minimum wage, however, is at a lower rate. Both have a commensurate wage component, which allow employers to receive special certification to then pay individuals who have disabilities which affect their productivity to then be paid a different rate. But again, that requires certification. The reason why I bring up this distinction is because in comparing the minimum wage changes that we have observed in the past and used as the basis for our simulation, we see a few key points. First off, we simulate going forward a change from the $9.50 minimum wage up until $12 and $15 by 2021 for large firms. We also then simulate a proportional increase of the small firm minimum wage, which would imply a $9.79 small firm minimum wage and a $12.24 small firm minimum wage for the $12 and $15 rates respectively. There are also a few things that are apparent when indexing changes in the minimum wage to inflation, which is what we have done in this slide. First, by looking at the $12 minimum wage, which is simulated by the yellow line, we find that in real terms, this minimum wage is precedented. It has, there were similar minimum wage rates in the late 60s and early 70s. Likewise, we find that the small firm minimum wage that is corresponding to that $12 minimum wage rate is similar to the current large firm minimum wage rate for the entirety of Minnesota. Again, that was $9.79 as opposed to $9.50 for today's rate. So when we mentioned earlier that there are 46 to 71,000 workers that would be affected by this policy, it is worthwhile to mention what we mean by the word affected. In this simulation, we first take a look at earnings, which again is defined quarterly, which allows for the possibility that although working hours may go down in a given quarter, again, if there are positive results, which we find, it would be that decrease in hours would be offset by an increase in the wage rate. We find that the simulations that we ran generally found an increase in earnings of between 10 to 30%. We also find that the increases are highest in the restaurant industry. There's also relatively high in the retail industry, and that most other industries do not have a prevalence of workers earning the minimum wage large enough to make a statistically significantly large simulation. I'm sorry. It looks like there was a slide that was missed. I will go back for a moment to the who would earn less than $12 and $15, the demographic component of our analysis. So in order to explain who earns the minimum wage and who would be affected by these changes in the minimum wage, the Roy Wilkins Center used a mixture of census data and data from the Metropolitan Council. And when we did this, we found a few interesting findings. As David Frank alluded to earlier, we find that there would be about 1/3 of African American and 1/3 of Latino and Latina workers would be earning under $12 an hour in 2021 were it not for this policy. So the increase of the minimum wage would then affect this population. We also find that half of the workers earning under $12 or $15 in the year 2021 would be American Indians and persons of color. So again, that would be representative of about 53% of those groups. We also find that although a lot of attention is given during minimum wage discussions to teenage workers, that actually 2/3 of the workforce who would be earning less than $12 or $15 in 2021, were it not for this policy, are actually above the age of 25. Continuing on this thread, not only are these workers likely to be above the age of 25, but we also find that of the minimum wage earning workforce, that 3/4 of this workforce are not currently in schooling. To be clear, in schooling is defined as either being in high school or in some kind of post-secondary program, some kind of college or university. It would not include professional certification programs like, for example, the Aveda Institute. Also, 3/5 of workers earning below $15 do at least have some degree of college, either some college, an associate's degree, or have a college-level bachelor's education. What's more, we find that in 2021, half of the workers earning below $15 are already working full-time being defined as 35 hours a week. Finally, we find that the restaurant, retail, and specifically non-hospital component of the healthcare sector have the highest prevalence of minimum wage earning workers and workers below $12 and $15. Given that I went over earnings already, I will go to employment now. When we simulated the changes in employment in response to a minimum wage, first off, we define employment as the number of persons who are employed in a certain industry, in a certain area. So it is an employment level. Second, most of the models that we used to simulate this increase in the minimum wage do not have an identifiable change in employment, which means historically, after changes in the minimum wage, it cannot be said that there is a clear causal reduction in employment that can be said to be caused by the minimum wage. There are a series of responses that we have simulated for how businesses would respond to a change in the minimum wage. First, as mentioned earlier, there would be an increase in operational costs. We find that this would be anywhere from less than 0.1% to 5.4% at most, and we define this as a change in labor cost that then gets translated into the share of total operational costs. So this is entire accounting operational costs that we find would have a 5.4% upper bound with the $15 minimum wage. However, the changes in, there is evidence, however, that firms do not simply change their payrolls in response to a minimum wage, that there's also some changes in their workforce that they employ, particularly in the way that they employ them. We find that there is a reduction in turnover, specifically quarterly turnover, which is defined as when an employee works at a certain location, at a certain business, and then continues to work at that same location 3 months later. So we find there's a reduction in turnover, which means that there are fewer people who are no longer at the same position. That means that there are more people who are still within the same position, relatively speaking, after a change to the minimum wage than there would be before. We also find that this turnover helps fight vacancy. One simulation that we studied brought up specifically the restaurant and retail industries in a hotel chain and found that filling the associated cost of filling a vacant position in turnover was approximately $2,000 until they get that position filled. And in reducing the turnover rate, then we simulate the change in the minimum wage would then cause a decrease in the number of positions that would be turning over. One difficult thing to interpret about this reduction in turnover rate is that there is a cost saving associated with this. However, this cost saving does not get realized in a normal balance sheet because it is the avoidance of someone not being in a position, so the counterfactual doesn't show up on a budget sheet, whereas an increase in the minimum wage would. However, the cost savings is still measurable. We also find that there is evidence that businesses may respond by changing prices in response to a minimum wage. We focused specifically on the restaurant industry because we find the restaurant industry to be to have the highest propensity for being affected by changes in the minimum wage. Again, speaking to 2021, if one was sitting in a restaurant and ordered a $25 meal in the year 2021 and turned on a light and created a $12 minimum wage that had happened as we had simulated over the 5 years previously, it would lead to an increase in menu prices of only about $1.11. For a $15 minimum wage, the cost increase for that same meal would be $1.66. This is accounting for inflation. Now, this increase in price happens for a few reasons. Largely, it is because 51% of the costs that are associated with an increase in the minimum wage are passable onto consumers. And when it is passed on to consumers, it then allows the cost of the minimum wage to be spread out amongst consumers rather than being burdened entirely by the business owners. We also find that this is something that is capable, or that is possible at a certain time, because all restaurants then are subject to the same minimum wage change at the same time. This particular study was looking at a specific geographical area, so there were no competitive issues because all restaurants had to raise their prices if they chose to in response to the same minimum wage at the same time, and there was not an issue of competition there. So to, again, summarize, what we've found is that by the end of the simulated policy, we find between 46 to 71,000 workers in Minneapolis would be affected by the proposed policies. We find that there are largely 10 to 30% increases in earnings, and we find that there is little statistical evidence that there would be a change in the employment level in response to the proposed minimum wages. Thank you.
I'm sure are you going to answer questions, or did you want others?
We have the entire team here, so we will be able to field questions. Okay. We have different specialties, and we can respond according to who is best equipped to answer your questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation. As you can see, we're paying very close attention. Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I did have a question on this last slide, in particular about restaurant workers. As the study noted, this is the biggest proportion of workers that are earning minimum wage now, so it's important, I think, for us to understand this piece. Could you talk more about how you estimated these, what I would consider pretty moderate increases in price in restaurants that would be phased in over 5 years? I know you talked about the methodology a bit, but just kind of for the layperson to understand, was this based on experiences from other jurisdictions that have raised the wage, or is it more of a economic theory approach to understanding what we expect we might see in restaurant prices?
Sure. Thank you very much. And I can speak to this. And David, if you have anything that you'd like to add on to it, you can follow me up after this. So the research that we did comes from a group who was looking at a county in California that changed the minimum wage. This group studied the change in prices before and after a minimum wage change, and they sliced that study a few different ways. They looked at full service restaurants versus partial service restaurants, or non-full service restaurants, fast food restaurants, chains versus non-chains, and the size of restaurants based off of their head count, whether or not how many employees did this restaurant have. Then after the minimum wage occurred in this county, they followed the change in price, and they used econometric techniques to try and measure how much of the price change was responsible because of the minimum wage. And what they find is it's a relatively small change in menu prices, and this is because the change in menu prices is spread out amongst the entire consumer base, and that consumers are willing to pay less than $2 for an increase in a $25 meal, that restaurants were able to raise those prices in order to accommodate those costs. Do you have anything you would like to add?
Yes, I'm just
If you would come up, just because we're recording this
course.
and then others who are watching can
Sure.
hear you.
So I'm David Cooper. I'm a researcher at the Economic Policy Institute. The study that Thomas referenced measured the price response in menu prices from a minimum wage increase that actually took effect. It measured what the actual price changes were. At the same time, we also simulated what the increase in the total wage bill would be from a $12 or a $15 minimum wage in Minneapolis, took that total, said if you assume no change in the hours that folks work, in the way that the business responds to that increase in labor costs, just took that entire labor cost and then took what labor is as a share of total operating costs for restaurants, multiply the two together, you get what the change in total operating costs is. And our simulated values were right in line with what that study that Thomas referenced showed. So we are fairly confident that even in our simulated even in our simulation, we're getting results that are very similar to what was found in real life when a similar increase took effect.
All right, Yep, go ahead, Councilmember Bender. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have one more sort of broader question, which is, if I think back to my economics classes long ago, we talked about the export economy versus the local economy, and it's not always a perfect separation, but you think of the export economy as being that which creates the bulk of the jobs or economic growth in a region versus, you know, the pharmacy or the local store that folks kind of need to get stuff from. And that's changing in lots of ways. But it struck me that the three industries where we expect to see the biggest impact because wages are the lowest now tend to be in the industries that are more of our local economy, our restaurants, our retail stores, and our healthcare industry. And again, you could consider restaurants as part of our tourism economy. Maybe people are traveling here because of our excellent healthcare. But could you talk more about that dynamic and what it means that we don't see things like manufacturing or tech or some of these large, sort of what I would think of as our export economy in this list of highest proportion of impacted workers?
Yes, you do bring up a good point. We do find that the industries that are most likely to be affected by the proposed minimum wages are service type jobs and less likely to be manufacturing type jobs. And this is for a few reasons. First, these jobs are specifically places that are based off of employee relationships. It's based off of being physically in the room. It's reliant on human interaction. It's not just something that can be easily exported, as you note. The reason why we find this change in the minimum wage does not change the employment levels of these industries as much is because we do see a change in the kind of labor that is produced. We do find that there's a reduction in turnover because the workers that are in this industry feel some they have some level of assurance after a change in the minimum wage, and we find that I suppose. Am I getting at your question? I feel like I'm missing something.
Yeah, I think so. I guess I just kind of wanted to have your expert analysis of my take on what we had seen, and it also struck me that the way that the study didn't cover this question about businesses deciding whether or not to be in Minneapolis or not, and it struck me that these are industries as well that make location decisions in part based on the fact that they're really part of our local economy, that they're not a factory that may locate in Minneapolis or in St. Paul or in Georgia or something based on all of these different price costs. So that it seemed also important to me to understand that how these kinds of businesses are making location decisions versus these other kinds of more export-based companies.
Yes. So the point that I think you're bringing up is that, yeah, these positions are particularly places where you have to be in the room to be able to deliver these services. You can't export a haircut, and you can't export elderly living facilities. You have to be available to be at that location. And the reason why we find that there's prevalence of the minimum wage in these industries is because these are that we don't find a change in employment in these industries is because these are industries who need people. These are industries who can't replace people very easily with technology or with other means. And we find that in response to the change in the minimum wage, they still need people. And they maybe see a change in the employee-employer relationship, but the fact that they still need employees to offer these services is a part of what it is that they're producing. That's what the good is that they have. It's a service good. So that's part of the reason why we find that.
Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate the report. And there's a lot more online and a lot more in the report to think about and figure out. I was a little bit curious about the poverty status and related to its impact. It looked like you just you identified there's 19,000 people who work in Minneapolis that are part of the workforce, but they're living in poverty. And I was curious why not all 19,000 of them would be affected. When I was looking at who would be affected, it looked like 12,000 would be affected workers if we raised the minimum wage to $12, and 14,000 would be affected if we raised the wage to $15 an hour. So I was just curious about why are some people, even if we raise the minimum wage, why are we still going to have hundreds of people, or in some thousands, I guess, actually still living in poverty? Is that because they're in the workforce, but they're only working part-time? Are they contract employees and they somehow exempt? If you had any information about that, I'd appreciate it.
Yes. So one thing to bring up, you do bring up a good point. The poverty rate is defined as falling below a certain income level, and if someone does not have enough hours, regardless of what wage they earn, if they do not have enough hours to meet that level, they would still fall under poverty status. But in order to go through that part of the analysis, let me hand off that question to David Cooper.
So just very briefly to answer your question, Councilman, poverty status is determined by total family income level. So, and each family's respective poverty line is determined by the number of people in their family as well. So you could have one person who's working full time who may have 3 dependent family members, and if they're not earning enough for those 4 people, they're still going to be below poverty. At the same time, there are a significant number of folks in poverty who do not work. So if you raise the minimum wage, you're not going to eliminate poverty for those folks. At the same time, in our simulations, we're not assuming any change in hours. So as Thomas was just alluding to, if someone doesn't work enough hours, even if you increase their hourly wage rate, in our simulation, it's not going to necessarily move their income enough to bring them above the poverty line. Plus, we also don't know what's happened to the income, any income going to other members of that family. So that's why you don't see an elimination in poverty, even though our findings do show that folks in poverty who are currently working would be disproportionately affected by the proposals.
Absolutely. So to be considered in the workforce, is there a minimum number of hours that you thought people were working, or is it 1 hour a year, or what?
So in the data, they had to be working. It was a very low bar. They had to be working at least 10 hours a year, something like that. They had to have been working at least some portion of the year in the prior year and earned wage income.
Okay. And so if you were working, do you happen to know how large a family you could have to be out of poverty if you were working full-time, making $15 an hour?
Well, so $15 an hour in 2021 is probably about $13 an hour in today's dollars. So if you're working full-time, full year, it's about $26,000 per year in today's dollars. So that would be above the poverty line for a family of 4, but any larger family size would still be below poverty at that level.
Okay. I was also curious if somebody could talk a little bit about the impact this might have on if it would have any impact on employment, because I think part of the idea you're saying is there are people who are living in poverty because they don't have a job. And is there an impact would that help get more people into the workforce or not? There's a lot of fears that it wouldn't. Mm-hmm. And I know you said there was one slide at least that mentioned how statistically insignificant that number is.
Sure. I'll let someone else. Bill, did you want to tackle that?
So William Spriggs from Howard University. There wasn't a significant impact on employment. I think you were asking a question which also asked about labor force participation. Would more people be drawn into the market? But we didn't have data to analyze the labor force response. Clearly, more people might be drawn in, but total employment, only because of the minimum wage, total employment didn't change statistically significantly. So we don't get an employment response.
Okay. And then I was also wondering if somebody could share some information about single parents, what impact we'd have on that. It's definitely a concern in the city here, I think, and oftentimes what the parent can make as wages has a great impact on the success of their children. And if we're looking at the long term, we want to make sure that parents have an option to provide for their children. And it looked like on one of the tables, it was a more significant and a larger impact on single parent families, but I was unsure about that.
Sure. To speak to that for one moment, I will comment on one of the findings from Dr. William Rogers, who again cannot be here today. His analysis was looking at food insecurity, which is defined by a survey that's run by the census that asks a series of questions, some of them being very specific to a household's food consumption. And it asks questions like, have you gone without food since your last paycheck, or have you gone without food so that your children could eat? Questions that are related to food consumption. And what he finds is that if you look at Appendix N in the presentation, we find that there would be a reduction in food insecurity for single parents within the city of Minneapolis. We would find a reduction of about 1,000 families' food insecurity, and with a $12 minimum wage, and 2,000 for a $15 minimum wage. One thing that should be noted is that there are also many degrees of food security that Dr. Rogers simulated. So there are some levels of changes which are from very food insecure, going to simply just food insecure, and then from food insecure to food security. So one aspect that we considered of the single parent family would be the impact of food security. And we find that there is a reduction in food insecurity in response to these simulated minimum wages.
Well, that's really interesting, and that makes me kind of say, well, here's a co-benefit maybe that we hadn't looked at or thought about. And I'm wondering if you did any analysis of other co-benefits. I could see how potentially, especially looking at this just generally from my life, as my income's gone up, there were other things that I could take care of and deal with. So would there be any kind of reduction in public costs in terms of providing health care to people, trying to find housing, trying to address crime issues? Did you do any kind of calculations looking at possible benefits, to even economic benefits to the general public by raising the minimum wage in the city?
Sure. So there are three things that I would bring up. First, in looking at the change of the city of Minneapolis, there's an ordinance within the city of Minneapolis which requires that persons who are employed by the city earn a livable wage, which would imply a certain percentage above the current poverty line. And when you do the math for this, you would find that the simulated minimum wages actually are comparable to the wage that is in the current Minneapolis city ordinance for its own workers. So we would find that would be first an instance where there is not the effect is the absence of the effect. The fact there's not a large change for example, the payment of workers for the city, because workers within the city are already earning enough to be for that. On the flip side, we also looked at healthcare and we looked at school attendance and education factors. However, we found that these reports were not easily applicable to the Minneapolis area because a lot of them were outdated and were not applicable to the current healthcare market, or were not applicable to Minnesota's education system. But what we find again is because these are service industries that are impacted, or that are affected by the minimum wage, the fact that there is a lack of employment effect in these service industries means that there's a lack of the change of persons who are in that industry's workforce. So what we see, instead of a change of services, is again we see just a change of what goes into those services. We see the reduction in turnover. We see an increase of productivity from those workers because they're not moving from job to job as much as would be implied by the turnover rate.
Okay. I'm
Okay,
going
thank
to,
you.
oh, thank you.
Good for now.
All right. Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much for your report. I'm wondering if any of the people who are on your project team have opined on the minimum wage issue in public, in the media. If I were to Google all of your names, would I find articles written, papers written, opining in favor of raising the minimum wage?
Would you like to? Yeah.
So you come to it with a opinion, a point of view that you use the research to support, correct?
The Roy Wilkins Center does not take a position to endorse the minimum wages that are simulated here or reject it. We were simply tasked with simulating what the effects would be of this minimum wage.
How many of you have opined in favor of a minimum wage in journals or articles or papers of the people on the team?
Well, I can't speak to myself.
All of you? Basically.
No, just those two.
Just 2 of 4. Okay, I was really hoping we would get a study back that kind of showed us what the cost benefit was, how it would affect businesses. But when I see a report that basically says there's no negative to businesses at all, it's hard for me to consider the report completely unbiased. Was a tip credit, for example, used in your analysis with regard to how restaurants would function? I have a lot of restaurants in my ward, and a 5% increase in their expenses could be the difference between making it and not making it. So while 5% doesn't seem like a lot, and it's certainly portrayed here as no big deal because you say multiple times that the change in employment is not statistically significant, there's no negative to businesses if we do this. But have you actually spoken to businesses who have a margin of profit that is 2 or 3 or 4 or 5%, potentially increasing their costs by that amount could put them out of business? How did you look at that?
First, I would note that again the the increased operating cost that we discussed is also met with a 51% pass through of those costs to consumers. So again, those costs aren't entirely realized by the employer themselves. We also, again, are basing our simulation off of the current Minnesota minimum wage, which does not have a specialized tier for tipped workers. There are, however, areas across the nation that do choose to have a special tier of minimum wages for workers who earn tips. However, Minnesota is not one of those states. And so for our simulation, we assumed that the $12 and $15 minimum wages would employ a similar design, which would also then allow us to rely on historical changes within Minnesota for the basis of our findings, instead of only using national data.
Madam Chair. But in Minneapolis, we don't have the ability to determine whether or not state law changes to allow or not allow a tip credit. So we could be passing a minimum wage without implementing that, or we could be preempted by the state from implementing that, making servers paid $25 an hour in order to get the folks who really have a hard time, which are kitchen workers and bus people, those very hard to fill jobs that also, as you know, in our employment in our city, you can't even fill those jobs right now. So the market is deciding what the wage would be as a result of the fact you can't fill those jobs. So I don't know that we can change that. I think what maybe the reason why I'm kind of zoning out to your whole report is that all of your key findings essentially say, it's no big deal, do it. There won't be any effect. There's no effect on businesses. That's exactly what you say. Oh, and the amount that we're going to increase is so limited that it won't really have an effect, or you're going to pass it on to a consumer. But when you already are paying $6 for a single scoop ice cream cone, how much more are people going to be willing to pay? I mean, there is a breaking point at which people who even make $15 an hour I wouldn't even consider paying $6 for an ice cream cone. So I can't imagine low-wage workers saying that now they'll pay $7.50 to accommodate a 5% increase in wages, and that's what they would have to do. So I kind of feel like you've underestimated how this would affect businesses while overestimated all of the benefits, including this whole issue of food insecurity. I don't think you need to be an economist to realize that if people get paid more, they have more money and they have less food insecurity. I don't need to have an economics degree to figure that out.
So I would just say, to the extent that you are, I think there was a lot of opinion in there, so I just want to say, the opinion is the opinion, but if there are places to kind of clarify what the study findings are, please let us know.
Sure. So again, first, our simulated change in earnings is not just an increase of the wage rate, it's an increase in the quarterly earnings rate, which means that it could be possible for earners to have their hours cut in this data set. But regardless, we find even if there is a cut in hours, there's still an increase in earnings, and that is offset by a change in the minimum wage. If there were, for example, a large reduction in hours in response to a minimum wage, we could have found a negative effect on earnings if the cut in hours was greater than the increase in the wage rate. But that's not what was suggested by any of the simulations that we ran. Instead, we find an increase in earnings between 10 to 30%. What's more, the design of the simulation that we ran was designed based off of the current minimum wage policy in the rest of Minnesota, because this allows us then to use Minnesota as a basis for comparison for this minimum wage. So although the city council could not obviously run anything contrary to state law, there could be, of course, many ways that a minimum wage of $15 could be cut to have many tiers. However, the simulation that was asked of us was simply of a level of $12 and $15. And a part of that was we had to make assumptions with respect to the large and small firm wage rates. However, this is a function of the fact that Minnesota itself and that Minneapolis workers are currently facing those rates. So to simulate those changes, we would have to have a similar circumstance in 2021 by the end of the simulation. Oh, one other thing that, yes, we would mention is that the earnings and the restaurant price increase and the employment studies, which we used for the basis of our simulations, come from peer-reviewed articles that have been discussed nationally and are not just a matter of a single single author's opinion, but these are indeed cited papers from across the country. And they're cited because they have particularly strong findings. They have the techniques that they use are designed to separate what changes happen in response to a minimum wage versus what changes happen throughout the industry already. Indeed, it's possible that there are other factors that would change the prices of the restaurant industry. These studies are able to zone in on the amount of those changes that are causally tied to changes in the minimum wage. But again, that's more of a question of how much of these changes are from the minimum wage versus how much are from other factors that are not necessarily a part of the minimum wage and are not the scope of our simulation.
Thank you. Councilmember Frye.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, generally speaking, an expert doesn't become an expert unless they've substantially studied a particular topic. And once you've substantially studied a particular topic and gained knowledge in it, you usually form an opinion. So in the field of minimum wage expertise, I think you have proponents and opponents of it over time. And I don't think that the fact that a couple of the individuals that researched the particular topic gained expertise, gained knowledge, and ultimately opined that in many instances a minimum wage increase is advantageous and beneficial should be
Pointed out.
it certainly can be pointed out, but I don't think that it should be conclusive of some sort of bias beyond the fact that the information has been gathered. I do have a couple questions though about first, I believe I saw a statistic within the larger report stating that about 50% of the low-income workers that would benefit from a minimum wage increase at either the $12 or the $15 level were resided in the city. Is that a correct statistic or close to correct?
Yes, our estimations for 2021 did have a measure for whether or not a person worked in the same location as where they resided. And we were then able to separate people who lived in Minneapolis from people who lived and worked in Minneapolis. And we found about half in 2021.
The particular county that you used in your study within California, what county was that again?
It would be San Jose County, I believe.
So it's my understanding that since that point in time when the county passed a minimum wage increase, the state as a whole has also passed a minimum wage increase, I believe to the same figure. Is that right? Was this happened? So the study for this particular county happened prior to the state minimum wages increase, right?
I'll jump in. So it was San Jose passed a particularly large increase in their minimum wage. I think it was back in 2013, and that's when this particular study looked at changes in restaurant prices in response to that increase back in 2013.
Okay, so this was in
and
2013.
Since then, the state of California has passed an increase to a comparable level that will take effect over the next 5 to 6 years.
Okay, so this particular county passed a minimum wage increase. Many other municipalities and counties passed a minimum wage increase, and subsequently the state followed suit.
Correct.
Is there how did this particular county handle the issue of 1099 wages and tips, et cetera?
California does not have a lower minimum wage for tips. It's the same as Minnesota. So in other words, there is no tip credit in California. So tipped workers get the full minimum wage before tips, just as they do here in Minnesota.
So I guess this leads to my question then. If the state of Minnesota doesn't allow a tip credit for their state minimum wage. If, however, a minimum wage, one could argue, and in fact I would argue, can be passed that goes beyond the minimum wage set by the state. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here talking about this today. And if you're able to pass a minimum wage that extends beyond what is required by the state as the base, $7.50 or $9.50, then it seems to me that you wouldn't be violating this state tip credit if you still were required to pay the underlying state minimum wage. Does that make sense?
That's a legal question that I have no idea the details of the Minnesota.
Do you understand my question?
I do understand your question.
Okay.
I mean, it makes some intuitive sense, but again, I don't know the law.
All right. And then if you go back, there was a study that was explaining how many the percentages of people of color that were positively impacted by a minimum wage. And if you could go back to that slide, you had the percentages at $12 and then the percentages at $15. It was early on. There we go. All right, so it says 1/3 African American, Latino/Latino workers under $12 would be impacted. Half of workers under 12 or 15 are American Indians and people of color. So do you, so it says half of workers under 12 or 15 are American Indians and or people of color.
So just to be clear, what it's
Yeah.
saying is that under an increase in the minimum wage to $12, 1/3 of African American workers and 1/3 of Latino workers would be affected by that policy change. Then the second bullet is saying of all workers that would be impacted by this policy change, about half of them are people of color.
I understand. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Cano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So first of all, I want to say thank you to the research team for taking on this this task. We asked a lot in terms of studying two different numbers in two different regions. And so I'm going to ask three questions, and I'm going to kind of say a couple of statements at the beginning, but I do have a question on page 53, so I just want to flag that for you so you can get ready. So these reputable scholars that are here today, which have been before the council before, particularly Dr. Myers, who presented to us on the foreclosure crisis, have a pretty good name nationally on tackling issues like this. And so I appreciate the time that you have spent pining over the numbers and putting this together. As a policymaker, what I'm looking for is an overall impact of what this is going to do to the city of Minneapolis and to our region. So while I understand that there will be sort of gives and takes, I am looking at overall impact and analyzing this initiative from that direction. So I'm not surprised that an increase of $15 as a minimum wage would benefit a large portion of our communities of color in Minneapolis. And as such, I think this is the most direct way that we as the city can help close the racial disparities in Minneapolis. And so in thinking about that, I do acknowledge that our small business industry is pretty robust in Minneapolis, especially in the East Lake Street corridor and some of the other corridors in our city. And I think that this is where we as the council need to step up and do more to support our small businesses, addressing the SAC fee issue that we know hurts so many of our small entrepreneurs, and looking at ways to support commercial land trust models so that we're helping those entrepreneurs of color build wealth over time, as well as looking to accompany our comprehensive plan efforts with policy directives that will lift up the cultural corridors of our city and that will have equal investment as we have put into stadiums and other downtown parks over the years. And so with that, I just want to kind of ask three questions, and I'll lay them out so that you can figure out who would be best to address them. We know that in the coming years, people of color will be the majority in our region. And I'm just wondering if these studies looked at any of that in terms of if we keep wages the same way, does that mean that more people of color will be kept in poverty for more years to come? So that's just kind of a thought going on in my head as I look at the future of our city and how we need to lead it. And then there was a bullet point, I believe, on the second, I'm not sure what number slide it might be 4 key findings, The change in business operating cost is estimated to be at its height 5.4% for a $15 minimum wage. I'm just wondering if that is an estimation for all size businesses or for a specific category of business under 500 employees, above 500, or kind of what that number entails. And then my last question is on page 53 of the actual study. You state that the minimum wage of $15 an hour would translate to approximately $31,000 a year. And then you have a chart that kind of lays out what the cost of living is for a parent and a child. And you kind of sum up the total costs of what it takes to live in the area. And that number, that annual number is about $53,500. That gap is still quite large, even if the city council did decide to lead and approve a $15 minimum wage ordinance. So I'm just curious about where that $53,000 number came from. I understand that you're looking at rent, food, childcare. I'm just curious about the sources of those numbers, because I could see many people thinking, that's crazy. It doesn't cost $53,000 to live in our city. I think we know better, because many of us up here on this dais would not be able to make a healthy living and raise our children on $30,000 or $50,000 a year. I have 3 boys, so I know the grocery bills are very expensive. So if you could please just kind of walk me through those 3 questions, I would really appreciate it.
Sure. I plan on answering 2 of the questions that you addressed, and then I'll hand off the, you're referring to the family budget simulation that we ran. I'll be handing that off later. So first point that you brought up is that there is a growing non-white community in Minneapolis. One thing that we observed when we started to look at the size of firms in Minneapolis is that if you look at who is eligible to pay the higher versus the lower minimum wage, the $9.50 versus the $70.75 currently, you find actually that minority-owned businesses, as defined by the Dun & Bradstreet credit rating agency, we find that they are actually more likely to be a large business than their peers in the surrounding areas, which then means that in our simulation, given that we've assumed, again, no change in behavior from in the response of firms in their choice between the small and large minimum wages, that would imply that minority-owned firms are already paying a certain amount and are, I guess, that much closer to the $12 or $15 number, and that they kind of already have that as a starting point. One thing that I would notice about the second comment that I would make about the 5.4 number is that this was generated. This one is specifically from the restaurant industry simulation that we ran, and it was particularly the largest number that we were able to find. We simulated several industries, but most of which actually had less than 1% changes in operational costs, because most industries do not employ enough persons below the $12 or $15 rate to be affected as largely. However, taking again the scenario that EPI has suggested, where there's no change in hours worked and no change in staffing and no change in the techniques that are used, if all you did was pay for that increase out of pocket, it would be a 5.4% increase in operating costs for the average restaurant industry, the average firm in the restaurant industry in the area. With that, I'm going to pass this off to David Cooper for any other comments on the industry simulation and the family budget.
So just to clarify on your second question, Councilwoman, the price estimates do not make any differentiation about firm size. It's just not possible in the data. It's just the average. On the question of the family budget, so the data that you're seeing there come from a tool that the Economic Policy Institute has published for many years called the Family Budget Calculator. And we collect data from about a dozen public sources on location-specific costs of housing, food, childcare, healthcare, other necessities, taxes, and then we aggregate that for over 600 communities in the U.S. And in this case, we used the data for the Minneapolis-St. Paul MSA. It was the smallest geography we could get in the data. And what we find is that when we look at what it takes to have a modest but secure standard of living, so to be fair, this is not absolute destitution. This is some measure of financial security. It would take one adult with one child about $53,000 a year to have that standard of living in Minneapolis today. And I should note that this is really just paying for those basics. It does not include any sort of savings, no savings for a rainy day, no savings for retirement, no extra money to spend on enrichment for your child, for example. So you're right, when you point out that $15 an hour in 2021 would be about $31,000 a year for someone working full-time full year, there is still a gap between what that income would generate and what we think you would need to have a modest but secure standard of living in Minneapolis. So that would speak to the fact that, you know, for a lot of folks, just having a job may not be enough. You may need other supports in addition to their income from work.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I too would like to add my thanks for all the researchers and the team for working on this project on our behalf. I have a rather simple question because there's so much information. It's going to take me a long time to really digest it. I'm not going to draw any conclusions one way or the other, but I'd really like to know how, in an example of a single firm that had, as an example, 2 employees. One was paid the $9.50 minimum wage, the state minimum wage, and the other employee was at $12.50. So there's a $3 delta. When you do the calculus for identifying how many people would be affected by a $12, suddenly that $12 one wouldn't be impacted. And then you add in the 15, if you add in that $3 difference, that second person wouldn't be calculated or impacted by that. Is the $3 differential between one employee and another employee maintained in the study, or is it separated out and only treated as less than 12, less than 15?
So one comment about that, the simulation, I'll pass this off to David Cooper in a moment, but there is a series of tiers that each worker is categorized into based off of their relative distance to the current minimum wage. And the simulation then uses that distance as a basis. One thing that's especially noteworthy about this is that the category that is used by EPI does maintain the current ratio between the existing small firm and large firm minimum wage and the commensurate wages. And with the techniques of that, I would pass that off to David Cooper.
So forgive me if I get too far in the weeds here. But the way the simulation works is we take everyone's current wage. So the situation you're describing, that $7.50 and $12 or whatever it was. What we do then is we iterate each step in the increase in the minimum wage. So if the first step is in the $12 simulation, it was 60. We simulated 5 steps of 60 cents. We did that first 60-cent step, and any worker in the data who made less than that new minimum that's now 60 cents above the existing minimum, we mark them. We say that they've been impacted. We calculate their change in wages, and then we assume some natural nominal wage growth in between each year. So basically, because we're projecting out 5 years, we're assuming that there's going to be some sort of natural wage growth occurring, even absent the minimum wage increase, because that's just what happens in the economy. As prices go up, employers will slowly raise pay, at least to match those prices, we hope. As that process iterates forward, when you get to 2021, that person who was making $12.50 at the beginning of the process, because we've been assuming they're getting some increase that whole time, they may now be outside the range of where they would get picked up in the identification of who's getting a minimum wage increase, but the person who was making $7.50 is clearly still going to be in the range of who would get picked up in identifying who would be affected by the minimum wage increase. So that's the way the simulation works. It basically grows people's wages out at some assumption of natural nominal wage growth, which in this case we assumed would be the projections for inflation, CPI. And then we said, as you slowly raise the minimum wage, how many more people are you going to catch through that process with each step going up and up and up? And that's how we come up with our number.
I think I understand it, but just really succinctly, in 2021, is there a $3 difference between employee 2 and employee 1?
Gotcha. So no. So we assume that there's going to be some compression in the wage distribution at the bottom of the wage distribution because of that rising floor. So in other words, that person who was at $3 or who was $3 below, now they might only be $1 below. We do assume that that person who was at $12.50 is probably still getting some bump up in their pay because lower paid workers are getting a raise. But we assume that that increase is not going to be quite as large as what the folks at the absolute bottom are getting. So there's still some distance between them, but it's probably shrunk.
I understand. So I think that might affect one's assumption about an operating cost for a firm. If that firm intuitively wants to maintain that $3 delta between employee A and B, or 1 and 2 is my first example. So just curious about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a series of about 4 questions to ask about this report. One of them is something that appears important to this population, working poor or people, residents in Minneapolis that live in poverty. In your simulations, in your study, have you seen a change in the ability to offer social services in these different cities that you've studied? I ask because a report I read about the state of Washington showed a significant decrease in the amount of social services that were able to be offered given minimum wage laws.
First, to answer that question, one component of the analysis that Dr. Rogers produced for us, and again, he cannot be here today, but one component of the food security analysis that he simulated was reliance on social services, programs like a reduced price lunch, like SNAP, like EITC, and the simulation that he ran accounted for the cutoffs and design of the state of Minnesota. So the simulation does account for eligibility rates within the state.
Thank you. The second is about cost of living changes. I understand that I'm less concerned about restaurants' prices increasing than I am that if most of the minimum wage increase, or 51%, as you said in your piece, are passed along to consumers, 2 of my concerns are how many of these workers live in the city? It sounds like in response to someone else's question, you said about half, but that's a really important point. So is it half, or can you point me to which appendix that information is in?
Appendix B.
B, thank you. And then how many, does this modest increase begin to make up for the increase in total living expenses based on your study? You talk about the increase in take-home pay, but when you look at all of the things, not just restaurants and healthcare, not just these 3 services, but does that amount of increase begin to make up for the increase in total cost of living?
Is this, again, with response to the family budget price sensitivity analysis that was ran?
Yes.
So to be clear, all of these simulations, they assume price inflation baked in. So in other words, these are real changes in income. So this is after accounting for adjusted in prices, anticipated increases in prices over the next 5 years. What is the real change in folks' income? So yes, that is baked into the model. At the same time, the increase in costs that we talk about for restaurants and other highly impacted industries, those increases are just industry specific. In terms of the effect on overall prices, most studies show that you wouldn't see any significant inflationary pressure for goods as a whole resulting from an increase in the minimum wage. And so we assume the Congressional Budget Office's projections for inflation as an underlying component of this entire analysis.
Okay. I ask because we have a disproportionate amount of low-income housing in Minneapolis, specific to our region as a whole. So to affect as many people living in Minneapolis in poverty, not in a negative way with a cost of living increase. That's kind of where I'm going with these questions. The third question is, it says in your slides, and you mentioned there's no competitive pressure. What do you mean by that? And did you look at it, because some things you look at based on a city minimum wage and a county minimum wage? A big concern I have here is, are we big enough to be an island? And if somebody's looking for a restaurant experience downtown or a lunch on Eat Street, that's hard to replicate, but there are innumerable small businesses across our city that would face the pressure, especially as you get closer to the edges of our city, where to me a county model seems to make more sense, but I'm not the expert here. So could you comment on that?
Right. So first, specifically, the price sensitivity analysis that was referred to was a county level, local level analysis. The comment on competition was to more highlight, I guess, some of the thought process behind what this change in price is supposed to represent. Given that there is a reduction in turnover, given that there's a reduction in the costs that are associated with turnover, one might ask, if one's willing to save $2,000, as that one study suggested, why don't they do it? And part of the answer is that businesses are concerned with keeping up with each other. So that was a comment that was meant to say that the reason, the motivation behind why firms may not be offering higher wages unilaterally without the policy implication is that they feel like they are competing with each other. And with a policy-wide increase in the minimum wage, that would not be the case. There have been instances, however, there have been local retail establishments, Costco's and whatnot, that have increased their wages for their workers without being forced to, and they saw a reduction in turnover, and they saw some of those cost savings. So that was the intent of that comment.
Thank you. My last question is in part in response to Councilmember Bender. Pardon me, your response to Councilmember Bender's question is, if these three industries that you mentioned in your report still need people regardless, what about the others that don't, again, where people are more likely to be replaced, particularly the risk of getting their hours cut in these other industries? Can you comment on that a little bit more than you have?
Sure. So the reason why the literature that we use focuses mainly on retail and restaurant industries, because that's where the largest effects would be seen. Given that there are the entire product that these firms are producing is based off of their staffing, that means all of what they're trying to offer is in some way tied to the minimum wage, whereas as Councilwoman Bender noted, goods that are tangible and produced are able to be shipped and moved around. In terms as to why these studies focus again on these industries, it's because these not only are industries that where the most amount of discussion revolves around, because that's where the most amount of change would be occurring, but it's also as part of an identifiability strategy to say that if we're going to be looking at changes in the minimum wage, let's look at industries who are going to be very reactive to the minimum wage, and let's use them for our baseline scenario. So rather than going into industries that have relatively low usage of the minimum wage, what lessons can we learn from the industries that do have a high sensitivity to changes in the minimum wage? So when we produce our estimates for the restaurant and retail industry, that should be seen as estimates that are based off of industries that would be most sensitive to the changes in the minimum wage. And that's why the literature tends to focus on those industries.
Thank you.
So we have 3 more council members in queue. I think I'm going to just kind of call the questions after that, because we have one more presentation from staff and then we need to conclude our meeting. I'll just say I myself have held my questions because I wanted to allow our colleagues to ask. I'm sure that people have many more questions, so maybe we'll have to talk to Mr. Frank about how to continue if there are additional questions. Council President Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And actually, your information about how inflation is adjusted for in the base is or what we call, consumer prices are adjusted in the base is very helpful. And that was one of the questions I had. The other question kind of goes to what you're saying too about what industries we'll look at. And I'm looking at this, it's not the slide that's in front of us now, but it's the food insecurity slide that you had. And one of the industries that I see being affected by a change in the minimum wage is actually the grocery industry. And they operate on a 1% margin. If memory serves me, I worked in grocery stores as a young person. And I am concerned about sort of the potential gallop that you might see in costs that are going to continue to go up as time goes on if we have a increase in the minimum wage, really affecting people who are the most at risk for just the basic buying their food at the grocery store. And grocery stores employ a lot, they operate on a very small margin, then they also employ people, not everyone obviously, but a lot of people, beggars, people that work in maintenance at the grocery stores are probably below 12 and $15 an hour. So that was the thing that hit me about, I think the concern for what this could do to stepping up that overall price increase that we would see normally if that would overall increase that is what I'm concerned about. I mean, you don't need to respond, it's just my head.
One comment that I would say, again, because Dr. Rogers is not here, is he does look at the average expenditure of a family on grocery-specific food, not just food, plus restaurant food, plus fast food.
Most poor families don't eat at restaurants.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he finds that there is an increase in grocery expenditures after the change of the minimum wage.
Okay, thank you. Is that someplace in the report?
Yes, it would be in. It'd be at the end of the report. It would be somewhere in the 200s, page 200.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have two more questions. The first is I didn't totally understand the back and forth about the issue of tipped workers, and I wondered if you could define a tip credit and just help us understand how those are tracked by places that have different statuses for tipped workers and not. And then I'll just tell you my second question, because that one is kind of a big one that I think you could probably summarize succinctly. I wondered if you could compare the $12 versus $15 amount in terms of the impact on prices in these key industries, as well as on job growth, just since that was one of the big questions I think this study was intended to answer.
Sure. So again, I guess first speaking to your question on policy design, there are some localities that have sliced the minimum wage into many different kinds of tiers. One, as you mentioned, was for tipped workers. Minnesota does not, however, have a special tier for tipped workers. We require that any minimum wage be paid to workers regardless of whether or not they earn tips. And the basis for our price sensitivity study is in California, which, as David mentioned earlier, has a similar comparable law.
So I think Councilmember Fry mentioned something about the 1099 tracking of that, and that's the part I didn't understand about how jurisdictions track who's a tipped worker or not and what wages they're making and not.
So there's in localities that have a tip credit, what that essentially means is that the way the law is defined is, I'll give you the federal law as an example. Under federal law, if a worker makes at least $35 per month in tips, their employer may take a credit that reduces the wage that they pay to that employee down to only $2.13 per hour, provided that whatever they make in tips over the course of 1 week averages out to an hourly rate that is at least the regular minimum wage. So basically, they're supposed to record what all the tips were, both in cash and credit cards, and then at the end of the week, do a calculation as to whether dividing that by hours plus that $2.13 gets them up to the regular minimum wage, and if not, they're supposed to top them off and pay more than $2.13 to get them up to regular minimum wage. It's entirely on the business to make that determination, and actually, you raise a good point. It's very hard to enforce because if if they're not topping the employee off, it's the onus is on the employee to then go to the employer and say, you haven't paid me enough for this week. And so the enforcement is a challenge.
And it's handled basically every pay period or weekly or
Weekly.
every pay period.
It's
Weekly.
calculated at a weekly
Okay.
basis. Yeah.
That's helpful.
One also quick note, there are many localities that we looked at in the study that design credits based off of other factors. Like, for example, if the workplace provides childcare or healthcare benefits, there are some places that have a similar credit.
Then there was that second question about the $12 and $15 rates and the differences in those wages on prices and job growth.
Sure. So, let's see. The way that we came to the numbers that I showed, where the increase in the cost of a meal that would cost $25 without the minimum wage, how much would it change if you implemented the minimum wage? And both changes were less than $2. And the way that we came to that number is, again, controlling for inflation, controlling for changes that happened within the county at that time. We used that sensitivity estimate to then say, given these two minimum wages that we've simulated, again, one being 5 small increases yearly until we reach 12, one being 5 small increases until we reach 15. That's how we arrived at those numbers. So when I mentioned 166 earlier, that would come down from the bottom of the Appendix H slide. So 25 minus 2666. That's where that number comes from for $15, and then comparably for 12.
Councilmember Warsame.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank the research team for their compelling study. I took it for holiday, and I'm still kind of confused with it, but thank you very much. And what I wanted to ask was, in terms of the jurisdictions that you looked at and other municipalities and the county in San Jose, what was the results in terms of low-income workers and people of color and the impact that the increase in the minimum wage had on small businesses? Somebody can talk about that.
Would you like to?
Yeah, San Jose case or a similar jurisdiction that you looked at. Just pick one, yeah.
So the San Jose study that we looked at specifically is just measuring price effects. So in that study, they weren't looking at, they did actually look at employment effects and found similar results to what we've reported here, that there were no significant changes in employment. But I don't believe they go into detail about effects on particular communities, such as communities of color. There have been other studies that have looked at impacts on communities of color, and because communities of color tend to have workers that are paid lower wages than their white counterparts, they tend to be more heavily impacted by increases in the minimum wage. Most of those studies, again, are all looking, when you talk about what happens to employment, they're all looking for average effects. So they're not necessarily looking at what the effects were for a specific racial or ethnic group. They're talking about, on average, what was the change in employment. So I don't know that there really has been great work looking at just the impacts were on particular communities within a local economy.
What about low-income workers in terms of, the people that would be affected by the increase? Has it had a beneficial increase?
I'll pass over to my colleague here.
Okay.
Well, we didn't. My specialty was on immigrant workers, and part of the analysis, given that the size of the population is not big enough, this is more on the national aspect of the analysis. And in the simulated of 12 and 15, low-skilled workers, immigrants. So this is within the immigrant population, immigrant workers were the most impacted in terms of earnings, the low wages, low earnings, and no significant effect on employment. If they find, as you can see, well, this is 160 page on the report, but you said that you had it here. And then we have, it's also in the appendix K and L are related to table 50 on page 160 of the report. If there any employment, what I found out on my results was positive impact on particular groups of immigrants, which are non-Hispanic white immigrants. But across all the group, the earnings or low wage impact was positive on within, again, immigrant workers. That's a specific or a specific group, but this is a national analysis, so it's not specific to the state of Minnesota. On average, Minnesota is no differently, it's no different in significant terms to these average numbers, if I explain myself.
That's a good point. And in terms of, can we? I'm kind of confused with the tip workers and how this I mean, the discussion that we've been having. You know, if you increase it for, I mean, if you increase it for all the restaurant workers, the tip earners earn more money than the back end workers. How would that impact the restaurant itself, or the bottom line of the restaurant?
Well, it would be no different than the current situation. Anytime under Minnesota state law, the minimum wage goes up. It's indexed to inflation rate, so it goes up automatically each year right now. So it would be no different. It would just be a larger increase. This is the same way it operates in seven other states that have no lower minimum wage for tipped workers. When the minimum wage goes up, tipped workers, because they're being tipped, do probably see a larger increase in their earnings than folks who are just getting the minimum wage and no tips.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Councilmember Andrew Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to thank the project team for this work. I appreciate the analysis and these data and look forward to doing a deeper dive and reading the whole study. But I just want to say how helpful it is to have that data available and to have some information that we can actually sort through when considering these decisions. Thank you.
Councilmember Frye, did you have a last quick one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Do you have an analysis of the racial breakdown of individuals that work in the back of a house at a restaurant versus in the front of the house that generally earn tips?
Specifically because the techniques that we used, we're trying to look at industry level effects, and it would require both data from the employee and the employer together. And that data is not easily accessible.
Do you have a breakdown of the take-home amount of money of the back of the house versus the front of the house?
So there's just no good available data source that looks specifically at earnings within restaurants, front of the house versus back of the house for the area that we were studying.
Okay, and so the assumption that was made is that if there's a state law, or if there's a state minimum wage not accounting for tips, then there's some form of preemption. Is that the assumption that was made?
Again, we didn't assume any change in terms of tip policy from what is currently on the books for the state of Minnesota.
Right. What I'm saying is that the state policy applies to the state minimum wage.
Right. And just to break in, I think the researchers already said this. I think that is more a legal question, and these researchers
I agree with you, but my concern is that an assumption was made based on the law that may not, in fact, be the law. And so I think we may need to go back and look at that. So I understand that California had many municipalities, and ultimately the state that enacted a specific minimum wage. Are there any other municipalities in the country that do not have an overarching state minimum wage policy that was subsequently adopted that do not account for tips? Let me ask it a different way. Are there any cities in the entire country outside of California that do not account for tips?
There are cities in other states where they do not have a lower tip minimum, like so Washington State, Oregon, right, California, Minnesota, Hawaii, Nevada, all have no lower tip minimum wage. Seattle, Tacoma, Washington, both have passed higher city minimum wage levels. Again, they didn't treat their tip workers any differently than state law.
So I'm sorry, Seattle didn't?
Seattle did not. There's no tip credit in the Seattle law, as far as I can recall.
That's incorrect.
Oh, okay.
I'm 100% positive about that. I guess Okay, I'll go back and look at it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Your recollection may be better than mine.
Okay.
All right. So I think that we need to turn, because it is 10 minutes to noon, to being able to hear this overview of a related presentation on how we might move forward on engagement. So I want to say as well, tremendous thank you to the research team. We have held you here for lots of questions, so I think that you can see people were very engaged and interested, and that your report was very, very helpful to us. And so I want to say thank you for that. I as well think that we were very fortunate to get such a respected group of researchers to come and work on this for us. And this will be important foundational work to us thinking about the impacts of what we're essentially about to talk about, which is how to engage with stakeholders in the Twin Cities area to talk about a city minimum wage policy. So again, thank you very, very much. And I'm going to, just before I forget to do this, move to receive and file our presentations. All in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? And so that we have time to do this, I'd like to turn now to our last and I think brief presentation, but important presentation, which is a response to the staff direction passed a couple of months ago, or maybe it was less than that, asking for the city coordinator to present an engagement plan for us to consider. Ms. Rivera-Vandermeide.
Thank you so much. My name is Nuria Rivera-Vandermeide. I'm the Deputy City Coordinator, and I promise to keep you brief. I always hate going right before lunch. It's like people here. Wanted to respond to the staff direction, and we had a staff direction that was really twofold. One is directing the Office of the City Coordinator to work with stakeholders, review policies from other cities, and to really review and incorporate the results of a very extensive study. But more importantly, what brings us to the table today is, or to City Council today, is to formulate a plan for engagement. And I want to say that one of the things that we were very fortunate perhaps to have just gone through a municipal sick leave policy, because the plan for engagement that we used there in order to bring recommendations and feedback from stakeholders was really robust, and I think served us well as we move forward in this. We have met and will continue to meet with the engagement design team. This is a new cross-departmental team that is really a one-stop shopping for any department who is looking to really actively engage on a variety of fronts, and excited about that opportunity, but also really excited to have folks in the room to really give multiple perspective to what engagement looks like. So we had some learnings as we did the sick leave engagement, and one of them was that listening sessions were really not just robust, but really insightful, and they were really helpful as we formulated our policy. So we want to continue and move forward with direct engagement and do a variety of listening sessions, and although we did 14 for the minimum sick leave, or the sick leave policy, here we're planning to do 10 to 12 listening sessions really focused on cultural communities, on industry specific. As we heard from the last presentation, there are certain industries that are more affected by minimum wage than others, so we want to make sure that we give people the opportunity to really express what's happening in their particular industry, and also a variety of public meetings to give all an opportunity to come. But we also plan not just to leave it at those 10 or 12 listening sessions, but we plan to augment that by a learning that we also heard from the business community in particular as we were moving forward, which is come meet us where we're meeting already. Don't create additional meetings that we have to fit into our current schedules, but come contact us, and where we already have a meeting scheduled, meet us there and do a presentation. So we're going to be contacting, I put a list of some folks, but obviously not an exhaustive list of the people that we are hoping to communicate with. But given that we have a little bit more time for engagement, and I'll talk about a timeline in a minute or towards the end of the presentation, we've really got the opportunity to really take advantage of already scheduled meetings where the business community in particular will be, from what I understand, happy to have us come and hear from them directly what the impacts are.
So I have a question for you from Councilmember Bender, and I also might have a question as well on this slide.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wondered, just having seen how much staff time went into the paid sick time discussions, do we feel like we have adequate staff availability to attend these meetings and the listening sessions? And
Chair-
kind of which staff do we think will be taking the lead on those?
Chair Glidden, Councilmember Bender, at the end of the presentation, you'll see a list of staff that's already been incorporated into a work group. And we do believe that, given our experience last year with what we did, that we've got sufficient folks to move forward. We may end up hiring a facilitator. We may end up hiring one of the additional learnings was that the written summaries of those listening sessions were really productive, not just for ourselves, but perhaps for council and for the community as a whole. And that was something that the city clerk staff did. I don't believe they have that capacity now as we talked about it, because there's just a lot going on. But we do value that and really want to honor that moving forward. And that may be something that we contract with and are ready to do so. So we believe that we are sufficiently staffed, and in particular, given the time frame in which we were given a staff direction, we believe we're able to have a good flow of staff component. The other additional thing, and we talked about this a little bit with staff, and we're going to be exploring, what we heard from sick leave was there are a lot of staff, particularly those who speak second languages or third languages, who would have loved to be participants in this. And so we may make a call out to volunteers as we move forward in these meetings. They will be at different times of the day, but there's a lot of people who want to lend their particular skills and talent to this, and we may be able to use them as well.
Thank you. So this was my kind of, I guess, comment / question is, so I think that engaging in these established meetings is really important, that you have a good list here. I would just note that, and this may be the nature of kind of the kinds of groups that have established meetings, is these are all business-oriented meetings, and we are going to need to think carefully about how we're able to balance that with the worker side of those industry-specific areas that we're focusing on, and kind of the other ways that we're thinking about this. So maybe that is just kind of some food for thought, and to continue to get some advice on what might be those ways to balance out our sets of meetings. So
Chair Glenn, duly noted, and I really want to make sure that we note that this is not an exhaustive list, that we have in our mind frame, that we want to make sure that we get a balanced perspective as we move forward, because it's that balanced perspective that will allow us to make a recommendation that we think is full and really takes into consideration a variety of viewpoints. But,
okay, thank you.
We will also try to be as transparent as possible, and that is another thing that we found successful as we did our municipal sick leave policy. And thanks to the great quick work of the engagement design team, we already have a landing page that is on the city website that is live, that already is fed into it, this presentation, the report, and so forth. We're going to make that a little easier for folks to find as we put a link to that on our very first homepage. But for now, it is Minneapolis MN/minimum wage. But we will make that easier for folks to find from the homepage. But at least that is up and running, and we've got a good path forward as we continue to populate that. We will include in that landing page a series of calendar of events and listening sessions. We will have, as I mentioned before, the summaries of those sessions, any additional reports or research that we come across in our way, or if we decide to do surveys, we will also be linking those there. So I really mention this to make sure that City Council and the public knows that we will be as transparent as possible in this process moving forward. I also want to say that we will have a link for folks to leave comments should they want to do so, written comments, and there will be an email address in which they can do that, and staff will be able to collect those and include those in their consideration as they move forward with the recommendation. Part of the engagement design team, as I mentioned, includes our arts and culture staff, and we have enlisted, or will be enlisting, the help of a graphic artist. As many of you noticed today, this report is very dense. It's complex work. It's important work, and we wanted to make sure that we have a way to speak to our stakeholders in a variety of methodologies. And we're thinking about infographics, about visuals, about different ways to present information. So we will be enlisting the help of a graphic artist to make that information more accessible. We will be working this month to be on, and we've actually already started, but we'll continue to work on things like frequently asked questions, just easy, digestible materials, because not everybody is going to read the voluminous report that was issued forward. And so we want to make sure that we are able to provide as much information in an accessible format as we will. And we're also cognizant that not everyone speaks English as their first language, and we want to make sure that we translate some materials, some critical materials, as we did with our municipal sick leave policy, in different languages or provide different forums. And so that'll be a consideration as we move forward. Lastly, I wanted to point out that we will also be including the Workplace Advisory Group. City Council approved a Workplace Advisory Group, and applications, I believe, are due at the end of next week. So we're hoping as soon as those applicants are named that we can start involving them in the process. But the consideration of our timeline takes into account having them be a participant in this as we move forward, being sensitive to the fact that they will also be engaging with the municipal sick leave policy. And so we have been conversing with civil rights to make sure that whatever overlap we may have, we can be considerate of their time as well as that moves forward. So before you is a very high-level timeline that really speaks to where we think we can be. As I mentioned, this month we'll really be developing communication materials and planning for outreach. We hope that through November and February, between November and February, we'll be holding those listening sessions and meetings. We believe that time frame, even though there are some holidays in there, will give us enough time to key into meetings that are already planned and to create some of our own in order to move forward. So through March and early May, we believe staff will be synthesizing that information, getting all the comments that we've received, getting all the summaries and all that feedback from the listening sessions so that we may present a recommendation by mid-May, as there is an interest to be able to move on something by the end of the second quarter. So our hope is to have a presentation mid-May. I did not put a date on that in awaiting for the calendar for 2017 to be approved for next year, but we will certainly be, that is our plan right now to be doing that. And throughout the whole process, we will have staff looking at peer city and additional research that's needed. And finally, wanted to just share with you the staff that's already been called, that's been called to action, if you will, some of which, particularly in CPED, they've already been deeply entrenched in this work, and some other folks that have been working on the communication side. But we'll be working with these folks and adding additional resources as necessary. Happy to stand for questions.
All right, I am not seeing questions. I do want to note, that this engagement plan was eagerly awaited as well, even though I think a lot more questions fielded to the study team. But I know there's been a lot of interest too in kind of what is the recommendation from the city coordinator's office that allows us to kind of start that formal process of engagement. And so I want to thank a very large team of staff that have been working and are continuing to give their talents and time in terms of energy and ideas and the basic work that we need to do to make sure we're being transparent and doing all the other things that we know are important to moving this work forward. So with that, I'm going to move to receive and file the presentation. All in approval, please say aye. 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 Opposed? That item is approved. And finally, we have reports of committees. I'll note it is 12:01, and I may just ask if there are significant items that committee chairs would like to mention to us, or however you'd like to handle it. And I'll first ask Councilmember Goodman with Community Development Regulatory Services.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The committee is bringing forward 14 items. I will note the most significant item is that we're moving into round 6 of Green Homes North, which is the last funded round right now of Green Homes North. There are 12 lots that are going to be sold by our action on Friday, resulting in 106 total lots completed under Green Homes North. I also just want to note, both in CD and also in Ways and Means, there are some changes to the Target Center Health Club lease modification, all to our benefit as we move forward with working with the folks at Lifetime in order to continue the construction on Target Center and keep Lifetime open and in response, and thank you for their $22 million private investment in the building.
Thank you. Councilmember Gordon with Health
I just
Environment
wanted
and
to
Community Engagement.
thank the committee for moving forward a small resolution that I had to establish recycling chute requirements for new construction, and note that I'll be bringing forward an amendment tomorrow just to encourage people to also look at organics. I'm working with Councilmember Brian Palmisano on that, and I can share more information between now and Friday with all of you.
All right, thank you. Next, Public Safety with Councilmember Yang.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. I will pass.
Okay. Next, Transportation Public Works with Councilmember Wright. Any
Thank you.
significant items?
We have 15 items. Thank you, Madam Chair. We have 15 items. I think all 15 items are consistent with the typical work of the department at this time.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have Ways and Means. Councilmember Quincy had to leave. I'm the vice chair, and I'll just note we have 8 items coming forward. These were all consent items at the committee level. And last, Zoning and Planning with Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have 5 items. The 2 most significant is a variance appeal for the Alatis Tower at 200 Central Avenue Southeast, as well as approving a civic engagement calendar for the comprehensive plan update, which will kick off public engagement in October.
All right. So thank you to my colleagues. With that, we have concluded with our business, and we are adjourned. Thank you.